Hello, everyone. I am Phil Svitek, joined alongside Marisa Serafini, and it's that time of the month to talk about books. And in this month, we are talking In 5 Years by Rebecca Serle.
Serle.
Serle names, it's one of those things when whenever they say don't make fun of someone who pronounces a word wrong because it means they're a reader. So I'm going to use that as my excuse. But anyway, we're here to talk about it. We love books. So each month, Marisa and I get together and talk about a book that we alternate on in terms of choices. Now, this is actually a book that I chose. I don't know how it came to me, but it just looked like a fun read, and it came well regarded. I have not heard of the author before, but quite well known at this point. And so, yeah, for me, it actually lives up to the hype. But I want to kick it off to you and, starting with just overall thoughts.
First of all, thank you for picking this book because I really enjoyed it. And I'm kind of like kicking myself that I was the one who chose this. So good on you. I did see this at a Barnes and Nobles one day. I was just passing through, how it's like usually on one of those end cap things. I did see it. I didn't like read through the synopsis, but I was like, oh yeah. So when you mentioned it, I was like, oh, I've heard of this. I really enjoyed this book. Not gonna lie, I started it, only got it a couple chapters in, so I didn't like really get into the flow of it until like a couple of weeks later when I actually sat down and read it. And boy, did I zoom through it, man. And I was even texting you. I was like, I'm flying through this book. I cannot put it down. It was great. I loved it. It was emotional, easy to follow. It wasn't like all over the place, but you can understand how young people like you and I feel like it really caters to our youthful generation in that sense. So like always working, but still in that point of our life, figuring out where do I want to go in life? Do I want to get married? Do I want to settle down? Well, like it definitely caters to our current age right now, not to like timestamp the show in that sense, but I definitely felt all the emotional beats that this character was going through. And I really enjoyed it, especially at the end. We'll get to it, but man, did it hit me. It really hit me.
Yes, indeed. So we're going to get into spoilers fairly soon. So in that sense, go read the book. We encourage you, obviously. Let's start with the quick background, right? So Rebecca herself, she's an author, right? As well as a TV writer. And she's co-developed TV shows like Famous in Love. And yeah, so her other books are One Italian Summer, The Dinner List, Truly Madly Famously, Famous in Love, The Edge of Falling, When You Were Mine, and then of course this, right? So even just by the titles, you can start to see a theme develop. A lot of her books take place in New York, specifically, even though she now lives in Los Angeles. She does have an affinity towards Manhattan and so forth. And one of the things I appreciate, whenever a new book of hers comes out, she actually does book clubs, and you can actually request to have her participate in your book club. So I think that's a fun way to like promote the book as well as just interact and so forth. But yeah, what did you know about her going into it? Like I said, I didn't know anything beforehand, but
I didn't really know anything. I don't want to say that like I've heard of her because, thousands, millions of authors out there, but I have heard of Famous in Love because of our previous network that you and I used to both manage and run. We covered that show and we did the after show for it. So Famous in Love was like constantly in the back of my mind. I knew what the show was, but I didn't realize Rebecca Serle was a part of it, and that was her creation. So good on her. After reading this book, I'm kind of interested in retroactively going back and watching the show. If it's anything about her writing and her storytelling, I'm actually interested.
Yeah, I mean, the book is fairly short. It's 200, let's say 50 pages.
50 pages, yeah.
Yeah, 250. So it's a quick read. And you could tell that she has a background in TV because it reads very visual and very fast paced. and it maximizes its effect. And in that way, for me, it was very much a page turner, and it sounds like it was like that for you, correct?
Absolutely. And you can do like this book, I felt was written very cinematically, like you say, not to like steal your words, but like I could clearly delineate a first, second, third act in which, you know, a movie can take place. And this, I mean, you could go chapter by chapter. If you're going to break it up into a TV series, you can definitely break it up in episodic forms when it comes to like character or stories or locations. But then the book, it's easily, there are a lot of points where you can stop and not miss anything and then resume later. So, I mean, in any form that they want to put this out there, it's easy to tell.
Yeah, and it's written in first person from the main character of Dannie. So while we get her internal thoughts and, you know, reactions to stuff going on, still it's through a very visceral sense, in that way, as opposed to just these long monologues of flashbacks and flash forwards. It's in reaction to what's happening right there in front of her. And I think, you know, an actor can certainly carry that without needing to spell it out through a voiceover or something like that. So I really appreciate it. And what it's about, here was the interesting part for me. The book is called In 5 Years. And by chapter 3, you get a flash forward, call it a premonition if you want, of like something that happens. And right then, she essentially wants to negate that from ever being a reality. And the way it goes about it is in a completely unexpected way for me. You know what I mean? I don't know if you like expected it to go in the direction that it did, but I certainly did not.
No, definitely not. Because we see that trope a lot in movies or TV shows where it's like you think it's a vision, premonition, whatever. And then you see the character do everything in their power for it to not come true and come to fruition. And I liked it because while we saw that very, very quick chapter of her flash, and then as you continue reading the book, me as a reader, I don't know about you, but when I kept reading, I was like, so how does this actually lead up to that moment? And that's what I appreciate in the storytelling of this. It was very linear. It's not like we were jumping back and forth, going from here to the 5 years ahead, going back to present and whatnot. So I liked seeing the slow turnout, like whatever decision she was making was leading to the next. And it was easy in that way. It was easy to follow along and how the reader got to where we were and who she meets in her life.
Yeah, exactly. And what's interesting is like the more she tries to make choices that veer off that path, the more it brings her towards that path. And that's what I appreciate. Anytime like something happened, it was so like specific in terms of the detail that you're like, ooh, oh no, this is bad, right? It didn't need to be spelled out. It's like they walk into this apartment and it's like, oh, that is the apartment that she saw in her vision. Oh no.
Mm-hmm.
So
right, and exactly, and then like, and even up into the moment where she meets Aaron/Greg, you're like, oh no, is there gonna be a love triangle, which we're so conditioned to expect between a best friend and, you know, the significant other. And then as a reader, I was like, oh no, what's gonna happen here? Are they gonna cheat? Whose heart's gonna get broken? So as a reader, there was a lot of things that you think is gonna happen, but ended up not happening. And I appreciated that because it kept me on my toes. And as very big consumers of media and books and storytelling in that way, like you would think it was predictable, but it really wasn't. And I appreciated that.
yeah, so reverse engineering it, it sets up the whole notion that her and David, they just got engaged. Things are going really well with her job and everything, supposedly. So happy life, happy wife, all that good stuff, right? And so looking back on it, she doesn't end up with David. And in that sense, I don't want to talk about anyone else yet, just like her relationship with David. Could you have foreseen that? You know, that he ultimately, like it was I don't know, not that they got married, but let's just call it a marriage of convenience.
Yeah, definitely marriage of convenience, but also just like the marriage of expectancy, which I feel a lot of people in their 30s were approaching that age where people are like, you've been with this person for so long, either, you know, not to make it all graphic shit or get off the pot, it's like get married or get not or not. So, and like she has been with David for so long, it just kind of makes sense. They're like, well, we should finally get married, everyone knows we're in love, blah blah blah. But when you keep reading and she keeps making all these excuses for the reason why they're not getting married, like it's either work or best friend or all these X, Y, and Z factors. You're like, no, I don't really think your heart's in it if it's been prolonged this long. And you're like, no, I don't think if you really wanted to get married, you would have done it by now.
Yeah, I mean, certainly that is the argument. Part of me, because I related so well to Dannie, I could see myself just postponing something like that for years on end of like, well, there seems to be this more important thing. But I guess that is the lesson that, yeah, if you're putting it off so much, then, you're really lying to yourself ultimately.
Right. And yeah, it would be frustrating for like a normal person. I'd say, who's making a quote unquote normal salary. You make all the wedding plans, spend thousands of dollars, and then it not happening. I think it would be upsetting. But, because she was so financially well off, like spending thousands of dollars was like nothing to her. So she didn't really seem like all that upset that she put all this planning, all this money in for her to call it off. Well, really for David to call it off. And like it didn't bother her all that much because I think deep down she knew that it wasn't going to happen anyways.
Yeah, that part of the story to me was the fantasy element of it, of like, oh, they're like 30 years old, able to afford all this stuff. I'm like, I know they got good jobs, but New York's expensive and all this stuff, So all right, we'll go with it.
Manhattan, all of that. And I'm like, okay, what's that like? I was like, all right, so that's where you kind of have to suspend your disbelief. But yeah, maybe that's just the better side of me, that being in our 30s and not making that much in salary. Like, oh, okay, they're both well off, they're well to do, and even her best friend was well to do. So, I think finances definitely wasn't a theme in this movie. It just happened to help her move along the storyline. Yeah. So,
I mean, it was interesting. Like in the traditional sense, it seemed like Dannie and David were very much that upper middle class version, and Bella, her best friend, was old school money.
Yeah.
Because like, I mean, if they're the only reference to like any finances is like, oh, Bella's really rich. It's like, well, okay, if she's rich by your definition, she must have a lot of money.
Yeah, yeah. And, it kind of goes back to like Crazy Rich Asians, how they definitely explain how the new money versus the old money. And I like that. It didn't really bother me because it wasn't about finances or money. It was about the character relationships, which, I enjoyed.
Yeah. So let's talk about Bella. So Bella's her best friend. She's set up fairly early on, right, where Bella knows about the engagement that's about to happen. She's excited, which is interesting in hindsight because maybe it was a testing of the waters by Bella to see like how she was going to react to it all, because it's Bella who eventually says like, you've not really had love. But either way, it creates quite a dichotomy of the two characters, right? And it sets up that notion that ultimately Dannie is this worrisome person over Bella and her lifestyle. And then by the end of the book, it flips.
Right. And what I enjoyed about Bella is that she felt like not quite the foil, but definitely the opposite of Dannie in the best way, where Dannie's like very high strung, very organized and structured, planned out her life forever. And Bella's just like kind of the go with the flow, like, hey, if it happens, it happens. And here, Bella's been in this long-term relationship and is moving really slow. And Bella just gets into this new one, is really moving really fast. So you get these two different versions of a relationship. And that's also fun to see when it comes to best friends and just how they are, but yet opposite in that way that still works. And I like that because Bella always questioned Dannie, but not in the wrong way, but like really questioned Dannie, made her like rethink her life that a best friend should do.
Yeah, absolutely. And certainly Dannie, if anything, was that judgmental side of it of, what are you doing with your life, and trying to push her. And that's kind of the nice part about it is ultimately, just in any sort of relationship, really, right? It could be a romantic or in this case, friendship. You sort of need someone that is a pull to your push.
Yes, exactly. You need that friend who will challenge you and makes you question everything and makes you just like push you along, whether it be mentally or physically in that sense. The one that keeps you going. And that's what Bella was. I really enjoyed Bella.
Yeah, and she was an artistic soul. And that was Danny's contribution, was to essentially get her to open up the gallery, to do the paintings. And I mean, in essence, if it wasn't for Dannie, there really wouldn't be quite the legacy for Bella leaving behind, through the cancer.
Right. And if it wasn't for Bella, Dannie would not have ever met Aaron/Greg. So they both played a humongous part in their lives, whether they liked it or not.
Yeah. So let's talk about that because, I mean, it felt like it was going to be a love triangle, and you mentioned that, but it really wasn't, even though they do hook up. And when they did, I didn't know how I felt about it, but then it's handled well, where it's like, okay, that's out of our system.
Right. I mean, and that's the thing. And that was the great thing about the establishment of the Aaron-Dannie relationship, because every time they meet, obviously they didn't start off on the wrong foot, or they started off on the wrong foot. And then Aaron's like working every single time to like win over Danny's affection, because, as your best friend, knowing that, hey, the girl that you're dating, her best friend has to approve of you. So I felt like it was that kind of acceptance in that way. And that's why Aaron was so determined for Dannie to like him. And I like that because he didn't force it. He like took the time and worked with Dannie. And every time they met, you can see that they had more and more things in common with each other. It's like, yeah, they're very compatible too. I'm for this relationship if it ever happens. So, and you see that a lot too. Like two best friends could be into the same person. Yeah, happens all the time. So that's why I was just conditioned to think, oh, is there a love triangle happening here?
Yeah. And especially, I mean, towards the end when Bella's got her cancer and things like that, part of me was wondering of like, bro, are you sticking around because of Dannie, or you actually are a good guy?
Right. And I like how Dannie questioned that, because that's a fair question. Is it more so, are you just here out of obligation, or are you really just, are you a good guy and really do want to see it through? And when he gave his answer, it's like, no, I'm in love with her. And it's only been like, what, at that point, 4 months? Like, yeah, you can fall in love with someone in 4 months. So, and because we know that he is a good guy, I believed him. I genuinely, truly believed he was there to really help Bella out. I was like, all right, darn it, he's a good guy.
Yes, indeed. And ultimately, I mean, there's no villain necessarily in the whole thing, right? Like when David and her break up, he essentially tosses her out, but at the same time, I sort of you get it, and
but rightfully so. Rightfully so.
Like it's like he's been strung along for 5 years, and like so you get it. You're like, what the hell? And I've been nothing but supportive, and I think what's interesting about it is it was Bella, but I think ultimately it was Aldridge who like pushed the final domino. Aldridge being her mentor, because in that environment, right, she's notorious for being so meticulous and detail oriented with everything. And it seems like if there ever was a place that would value structure, it's mergers and acquisitions law firm 101, right? In terms of what she's doing. And yet, in order to find that, like, the pinnacle of that all, she needed to react on gut and instinct.
Right, and I think that's also what makes a good lawyer too. It's not all about paperwork and details in that sense. It's also about knowing when to make the right decisions and when and where you make the right decisions, and also character reading and profiling people, if people's heart is in a decision or not. And she can kind of see, so that whole meeting with those two founders of Cutie, that company, she can tell one person was for it and one was not, which was like a nice parallel to her relationship with David at that point. David was in it and she was not. And I think that like really pushed her, just having that meeting really pushed her and made her self-reflect. Like, oh, a big decision's happening. But I feel two parties have to be a part of it for it to actually go through. And it really opened her eyes in that sense.
Yeah, and in the long run, that's what allowed that trust to be there. And then, yeah, I mean, it's what allowed her to propel herself forward in her career, was because of reacting on that instinct and knowing of like, you know what, yeah, I could try to shove this through. You know, they would make, I don't know, billions of dollars. The firm would make millions off of that deal, but it ruins a relationship, which could be worth tens of billions.
Would they be happy? Yeah, it's like you can have a fruitful relationship in that way, and not to say it's a failure, because it's very successful financially, but also at the end of the day, would you be happy? And I think that also made her be like, yeah, we could be married, and it'd be a nice relationship, but after all of that, would we be happy together? So like, it was a nice parallel that was happening with her in her life. I really enjoyed it because it showed, because a lot of those kind of big deals happen in real life, and people don't really, people, will strike when the society or economic, when economy works, but not, people don't put like all their time and effort into like, oh, should we do this because we want to, or should we do this because financially right now is the best time to do it? So yeah.
Well, shifting gears, someone that took me by surprise was Jill, which is the mom of Bella. And I'm not saying this in any way to like excuse her actions by any regard, but at the same time, she made the choice early on of like, Bella and Dannie need to be best friends. And if there's anything I can do as a mom that benefits my child, it is allowing them to stay friends. And she makes that decision. So, terrible mother overall, it seems like, but she got that one thing right. And so that caught me off guard in a pleasant way.
Right. And like throughout the book, and when Bella's going through her whole recovery and her surgery / recovery / chemo, all that, you're just wondering, like, where the hell are her parents? Danny's there every single appointment and meeting and chemotherapy session, but like, where are the parents? So, and especially when the doctor was like, oh, she has a good support system, but she doesn't have her parents. And then every time we see Jill, just like, you are such a negligent mother. I just wanted to slap her. And then when she finally got that moment where like, I just wanted to keep you two together, it was like, oh crap, but I can't hate you either. But you're also a negligent mother. But just because you did one good thing doesn't, make up for all the wrongs that you did to this poor woman who needs you the most right now. So I was very conflicted when it came to Jill.
Yeah, I was too. And certainly it was very telling that, I forget what they call it, but like Bella's primary, not caretaker, but essentially if things went wrong.
Like the emergency contact kind of.
Yeah. Exactly. It was ultimately Dannie, not any of her family members.
Right. But I was okay with that because it just shows just how close Bella and Dannie are. that Bella depends more on Dannie rather than her own family.
Yeah.
And I think that really helps, really cement their relationship.
Did you read it as that even Dannie was surprised to sort of learn that? Because it didn't seem like she knew that ahead of time.
I think as a normal person who would be surprised, like, oh, it should be the parents, should being the operative word. But when she heard that, she's like, it took her a moment to realize it, but she was also okay with it because not once did she complain because it makes more sense to her because she was at all of her appointments. She was at all of her sessions. So Dannie, as a character in herself, she cared so much about Bella that she took it upon herself to take care of Bella and know her routine and her schedule. So it made sense that Dannie was like, yeah, it should be her primary contact.
Yeah, and she really did turn into a superwoman at that point. I mean, even with work, right? Going back to the Aldridge subplot, he calls her in for a meeting. She thinks she's going to get fired. She's about to be promoted. And I think it's very interesting in that sense of how little we think of ourselves in certain moments, when in reality, from everyone else's perspective, you're this Herculean sort of person. Because as we were pointing out, not only is she handling everything in terms of Bella, like she's doing all the research, she knows all the lingo and she can ask all the right questions, but without realizing it, she's also able to stay on top of her job.
Right. And you have to applaud Dannie for doing the research too, because the moment that Bella got the diagnosis, she went lawyer and did all the research, looked up everything, because I'm glad it was Dannie, because I don't think her parents would have.
They certainly didn't.
Yeah,
not only they would not, they didn't
put the effort into learning anything about it. And Bella, being that type A lawyer, she wanted to learn everything about it. So she was more informed. And I think I'm glad it was Dannie.
Yeah, certainly. And it's a weird, in a weird way, the pieces of the puzzle do fit. Like, it's interesting because a lot of times, I think you do need that aspect of the dad was just this absentee parent, but he's basically, here's a blank check. Right. So again, not necessarily great, but certainly knowing the US medical industry, not a bad ally. So it's interesting how all these pieces sort of ultimately do fit together and help in the larger sense, even though emotionally you would prefer more.
Right. And that's the frustrating thing is about her parents, Jill and Frederick, is that just because you pay for everything doesn't make you the parent that she needed. At that moment, she needed emotional support, not financial support. And that's what's so frustrating about the parents. Girl, it was we're reading it as readers and we just want to hold Bella's hand and give her a hug, but that's what the parents should be doing, and they had no interest in doing that. And just because you sign a check over doesn't make you a parent.
Yeah. Let's shift gears and talk about Dr. Christine. She doesn't come up a lot, but she is the therapist who listens to the initial, future story of what will be. And then as soon as it starts getting too close for comfort, Dannie revisits her again. And it's interesting in that way. I think it's also telling how people sometimes only visit their therapist when it's an emergency, quote unquote.
Right. Right, because she hadn't seen the premonition happen. She automatically saw her therapist, and then it's been years since she saw her therapist again when it was getting closer and closer to the moment where it was actually going to happen. And I think yes, the therapist didn't really play the biggest part, but she did play her part, opening up all the questions, is this a self-fulfilling prophecy? Where are you in your life that you're actually allowing this to happen to you? I think it was just a checkpoint moment for Dannie to be oh yeah, this did happen to me. I did decide to do this, what have you. But I think Dannie honestly got more therapy from Bella's doctor than her own therapist.
Okay, let's talk. So Dr. Shaw, when we're first introduced to him, not ever could I have predicted that he would be a potential love interest by the end of the book.
Neither.
So I wasn't even, I just like read him as a doctor. He's not like whatever, but like I didn't pay attention to his physical appearances, any like, you know, if it was like a movie, any glimpses of into each other's eyes, was there a momentary pause? Like none of that. And maybe it was there. But yeah, this was the thing. I'm like, okay, it took me by surprise. Like, what were your thoughts by the end? And there's not a clear indication that they will get together.
Right. But it's implied that they could. It definitely implied. But yeah, it was a nice surprise to me because when they first meet, it's like that moment where you meet someone and they're only there to serve a certain purpose. Like at that point, he was just Bella's doctor. He was the one performing the surgery, the one who's like keeping them in the medical know of Bella's condition and whatnot. And we only saw him as doctor. But then once Bella was unfortunately slowly deteriorating and dying, and then Bella did die, then he wasn't really a doctor anymore. He wasn't serving that doctor purpose, that medical purpose. He was serving, like, she finally saw him as a person, not as a doctor. So to see him outside of his environment, so to speak, and in regular clothes and just as a person, she's like, oh, right. Okay. And I was actually kind of for it. I'm like, yeah, I see this. I'd be okay with this.
I'm okay with it. Like, I'd be very, like, I really want to kind of reread it, at least just those sections to see, you know, that idea of it. But I will say, if nothing else, I'm just glad it wasn't Greg/Aaron, because I would have been like, oh no, this feels very dirty. Like I said, they got it out of their system, and now they're both like off on different adventures.
Yeah. Well, and every time Dannie and Aaron met, it's like, well, you can read the sexual tension every single time, like how physically close they were, and like just looking in each other's eyes and lingering, and like all those visual cues of like, oh yeah, something's happening here. Great buildup to finally the release in that sense. I was okay with it, quite honestly. But if we're going to talk about that chapter, her premonition come to real fruition, real, actual, in that sense, the meaning behind it is what got me. Because when we first read it, we think it's like this intense, passionate moment. But when it actually happens, there's a whole different emotion behind it. And it's actually guilt. And like, oh, it's not fiery, it's not love, it's actual guilt. And it weighed more heavily than it did the first time.
Yeah, and I think, you know, certainly that's the strength of the book, is that it makes you rethink, like, in general, beyond just the dream of in 5 years, but life in general as she saw it, right? She's looking at it through one set of glasses, even though looking at the same thing. And then when she, let's say, takes off those glasses in terms of the metaphor, she sees a completely different world. And I think that's kind of the message is, you know, we choose to see what we see, you know, and we sort of have to get beyond ourselves and whatever else.
Right. And I don't think when the premonition first happened to her, she's not really thinking about the meaning behind it. She's thinking about, oh, this is what's going to happen. And then when it does happen, now she's realizing the actual emotional impact of it, which was so much deeper than what she probably initially thought, and what us readers initially thought it was going to be.
Yeah, and it's still interesting, like, you know, because you could call it, she felt guilt the first time because she was like dreaming of another man and just steamy hot sex. Mm-hmm. When she just got engaged to David. So, you know, so it's interesting you use the word guilt, because in a lot of ways, like, she felt guilt for just having that dream. Um, and then, yeah, I mean, she essentially avoids getting married because of all the reasons. And then once Greg comes into her life, it's like, okay, I need a safety net. So I'll marry David because then if I'm married to David, this can't happen.
This won't happen.
And it's funny how that's like the inciting incident for her to like actually be like, all right, we're getting married in 6 months. Let's go.
Right. I mean, that's the thing that starts it all, basically. That's the MacGuffin in that sense. And I liked it because we think it's going to set her on some timeline to avoid the December 15th, which is so funny because that's actually me and my boyfriend's anniversary. That's her timetable. Like, we have to avoid everything that will happen that leads up to that day. And despite whatever she does, and then reading all Bella's stuff that's happening to her leading up to it, like, crap. She's like slowly, like, she knows December 15th is looming, but she's not really thinking about that day anymore. She's thinking about Bella and the conditioning. And then when it actually happens, she's like, all right, it is today. Shoot, what's going to happen?
Yeah, absolutely. And it works out, like, I mean, the fact they are one and the same, right? They're opposites that complete each other, Bella and Dannie, because Dannie in many ways gave Bella a full life, and then Bella literally left her with a life, meaning the apartment and the stability. Because I mean, that was the whole thing. After Dannie essentially walks out, she doesn't know where the hell her life is going. Like, she has no place to live. Sure, work is going fine and she'll figure it out, but like, it's still like this big mystery. And so at least she has this like foundation of, I don't know, there was something like on a symbolic level, just having a place to like call her home. Because she really did love that place. And that's what kind of scared her ultimately. And so, yeah, that was the gift that Bella gave her.
Yeah, and I really enjoyed that because it was painful to read that when Dannie first saw that apartment, you could tell she automatically fell in love with it, but she shouldn't, because she knew, like, oh, that's Bella's place. That was her guilt. She's like, I shouldn't fall in love with this place because my best friend wants this place instead. And then when ultimately it became hers, you just got to applaud Bella for knowing her best friend that much. Like, no, this place was for you all along. And you're like, crap. And that was just another thing. You're like, Bella was such a good best friend to her in that way, like knowing all of her wants and needs. And that's what a good best friend does, especially one who has money, to give her a place of safety and security.
There was that aspect, and I'm kind of curious your perspective on it. The idea, let's call it a spiritual aspect, where, all the years of Dannie just being like, Bella, you need to like settle down and be more rigid and structured. Where in hindsight, Dannie starts to look at it of like, Bella just always knew she didn't have that long to live and she needed to live. And listen, I think ultimately it's that aspect of like, hey, it's a beautiful notion, so why yuck someone's yum in that sense? But I'm just curious, like, your thoughts on that idea that Bella ultimately, like, she was living a life to the fullest because, I don't know, call it a sixth sense. There was this intuition that, something would behoove her in a problematic way.
Right. And I think that's the beauty of Bella's character, being the person who's like so go with the flow. Because I feel like if this ovarian cancer happened to Dannie instead, Dannie would be like, she would structure her life and overstress herself to the point of, how do I fight this? How do I fix everything wrong in my life before I die? And Bella was just like, what happens. It is what it is. And I think that ultimately helped her character because she knew she had such little time. She was like, I'm going to just fix this or do this for my best friend, do this. And she used her time wisely. She wasn't that overstressed that Dannie would have. And I think it not to say that Bella was the better person, the better choice for this cancer to happen, because I'm not saying that at all. But I think it was more beneficial that it happened to Bella instead of Dannie, because Dannie would have approached it completely different than the way Bella did.
Indeed. Well, I want to, so as part of, there's like a reading guide on Rebecca's website, which I'll link to in the description. But I want to read this. So the question is, Dannie and Bella are such distinct characters. Why did you choose to portray them differently, right? And so the answer to that, per the author Rebecca, I knew that in order for the conceit to work, Dannie would have to be someone with an airtight life plan. She would have to know exactly what she wanted and was building towards. Dannie comes by her uptight nature honestly. She lost her brother when she was young, which we should also talk about, and has had the need to control her life since to make sure she is never stuck down by tragedy again. I also knew I wanted to give her a counterpoint in Bella. Bella does not have any of Dannie's rules about life. She is open, creative, impulsive. In many ways, and Dannie's journey over the course of the novel is to embrace her own Bella-ness. I think I'm a pretty clear mix of the two, but gun to my head, I'd say I'm more like Dannie.
Mm.
Yeah. So let's go ahead.
And I think that's why their relationship works so well, because they are so opposite. They balance each other out.
I agree, and I think it is an interesting note in that about the brother, right? So she has this brother who passes away tragically. It certainly affects her mother, and then Dannie essentially has to really become an adult fairly quickly, and that sticks with her. And so, yeah, it's interesting how like tragic moments essentially affect your whole mode of operating because it's a direct reaction to it.
Right. And also the fact that she lost her brother immediately. That wasn't a slow death. It was a tragic accident that happened so quickly and turned her life upside down. And now having Bella's with a slow death, she took all the time in the world to like help prevent it, to help slow it down in that way. So like that was a long burn for Bella's relationship and her death in that sense, because her brother, she could not control that. But for Bella, she did her best to control it.
And still, I mean, part of it is like, as sad as it is, that's just part of life. And, that is the lesson is, you can't control life in that way as much as you would want to. It isn't fair ultimately that anyone gets any sort of cancer, right, or any sort of disease, and we could fight against that, but that's just fighting against nature.
Nature.
And so we do the best we can in that sense. I want to again, this there's a whole like companion piece to this, and so I figure at random, I'll just pick like a question or two from the reading discussion. To Dannie, law is like poetry, but poetry with outcome, poetry with concrete meaning, with actionable power. This is on page 10. She later describes law by saying that everything is there in black and white. How does law empower Dannie? To what extent do you think law shapes how rigidly she sees the world? As the book goes on, power is often taken out of Dannie's hands. Do you think her background makes this lack of control harder for her than it might be for others?
That's a good question too, because I mean, there's that whole saying, knowledge is power. And I think that's what is the lawyer in Dannie, is that the more she informs herself and educates herself about anything, the more powerful she feels, and she has that control over whatever it is she's tackling. But since, she can't fight nature in the ways of this cancer is overpowering her in that sense, that's where she has to give up her power. And that is what makes her so out of character, because as someone who's constantly in control of that way. And there's always that running joke or the line where she's always telling other people, like, people are saying I'm controlling. Like, yeah, you are controlling. So she's very self-aware of her controlling ability. But when she can't control this cancer that's taking her friend, that's where she's starting to lose herself, because she doesn't recognize herself in that way.
Yeah, and it's also like if you think about it from a legal perspective, right? You write a law, a legal document, contract, whatever it is, and it seems as black and white as it can be, and yet it's all in the application and the interpretation of these laws, right? And so, in
Right.
that sense, whatever's written still kind of enters the world, and you lose control of that. That's kind of that to me is an interesting part of just law in general as well.
Right. And that's also the thing with laws, and lawyers are always good about finding loopholes, finding technicalities to, negate whatever the original thing was. So I feel like that was where her lawyer and her was like trying to find the thing that will stop this ovarian cancer happening to Bella. She was doing her best in her right to like be like, how can we get away from this? How can we stop this? How can we stop from letting this happen? And when she finally got to that point where she can't, that's where she loses herself.
Yeah. Here's kind of an interesting. So earlier, Bella gives Danny a print of the painting that reads, "I was young, I needed the money."
Right.
What did she? How did you interpret that? Because like it was a very interesting gift, at least in my mind, and I was like trying to look into it of like what exactly does this mean?
I don't know. I feel like that's like very artist creative kind of reference because there is that it's not really a painting, but there is that poster out there of I was young, I needed the money. But I think that's the irony between these two characters that like again, they didn't need the money. They were so well to do, but when they were younger, maybe it's just they're the one thing that like really helps build their relationship when they were younger is that like, oh, they have this one thing that keep constantly you know how like best friends when they become best friends there's that one moment that like really cements the relationship. And I feel like this poster or this piece of artwork is what like really helped glue these two together for the rest of their lives. And then when she gets that poster near the end of the story, like yeah, they'll always be best friends.
Yeah, I mean, part of me, I guess, if there is interpretation for me, it's that like I was young and I needed the money. Is this essence of forgive me for I was young and stupid?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that to me, if anything, was the interpretation. But any
Mm-hmm.
final thoughts before we wrap this out? We should talk about the HBO Max adaptation as well.
Yes. Yeah, I'm so happy that they're going to make a movie out of this HBO because quite honestly, as a woman who loves the movie Beaches, I got a lot of Beaches feel out of this book. Not gonna lie, Beaches in my top 10 favorite movies of all time. So when, like, spoiler alert, if you've never seen that movie, when Hillary dies, we still have like 10 more minutes of the movie for us to like accept her death, feel her death, and then like slowly ease out of it. And then when I read this book and then Bella dies, we didn't even get 10 pages to grieve her death. And then Danny goes and sleeps with her man, and then like she feels the guilt. And I kind of had like an emotional grenade because I read this book so fast that it didn't hit me till after I put the book down till like 5-10 minutes later. I was like, oh crap. And then I texted you, I was like, no, I'm really feeling it now because it is such a slow burn that when it happens, like you're like, oh man, it just slowly creeps on you. I don't know for you, but for me, it hit me hard. And I didn't feel like I felt like the book just ended. Like Bella's death ended. They finally got together and her premonition came true. It meant different, but then the book ended and it did. I don't want to say it was unsatisfactory because it did have like a nice ending, but it didn't like I didn't have enough time to process Bella's death. I didn't. And like it kind of bothered me that I got emotional about it.
Well, I mean, it's interesting. If anything, it's a juxtaposition. Like when her brother died, you know, she's been ultimately processing it for years on end. Whereas with Bella's death, though very tragic and sad, and she will forever miss her, it was that epiphany of just all the stuff that we've been talking about. And so I don't know, maybe in a sense, like she was able to process the death a lot easier, which sounds heinous to say. And yet I think there's something poetic and beautiful about it of like, no, I'm going to, essentially it's the acceptance of she's gone, but I'm going to carry her spirit with me. Mm-hmm. And therefore she's never gone. So that's for me why I made it okay.
Right. It's just like literally Bella dies on like page 245 and then the book ends at 250. Like we didn't even get 10 pages to process her death. Whereas the Beaches movie, we got at least 10 more minutes. So like I'm actually very excited for the movie because I'm going to like bawl my eyes out, even though I know what's going to happen. But I'm excited for this to come to the screen because it's very well written. It's easy, like I said before, three act structure. It's easy to follow, and I can't wait until it comes out. I'll just say that.
I look forward to it too. It'd be fun. All right. Well, this was In 5 Years by Rebecca Serle. So if you've been listening to us, if you haven't read it and you've been listening to us, please go get your copy and read it. Next month, we will be doing Marisa's choice of Gabriel Garcia Marquez, 100 Years of Solitude. So this is a little bit of a thicker book, a little bit of a headier book than In 5 Years, but I think people will enjoy it.
And if you're not familiar with Marquez's work, he's mostly known for the Love in Time of Cholera book. If you've ever read that, go read that first and then read this.
Indeed. And then after that, we will be reading Salman Rushdie's Midnight Children. You will learn some history of India and Pakistan and, oh boy, world history and culture.
Yeah.
So yes, that's what's on the docket as of right now. Marisa, plug all the stuff.
You can follow me everywhere at Serafini TV.
And I'm at Phil Svitek. Thank you for joining us. As always, if you have any recommendations for us that you would like us to check out, comment down below, and also let us know your thoughts on In 5 Years, and check out our past library, pun intended, because it is there. Thank you all so much. We'll see you next time.